Oh, it says live.
Welcome to this week's Global Christian Perspectives. I'm your host, Elgin Hushbeck, and again we have Chris Ayers, Alan Bevere, and we're joined by Jill, and I didn't catch your last name. What is your last name, Jill?
Olson.
Olson. Okay,
Yes.
got a number of interesting stories this week, and the first one we're going to be addressing is actually the first two we're going to address, comes from an article and some comments by Bill Gates, and he basically made some provocative statements about global warming and how he feels that not so much global warming itself, but how he feels the solution to it is in the realm of government, and how government is the only way that this problem can actually be addressed. The private sector can't do it. And so I thought we would start with that. You agree with, we're going to set aside the issue for the most part of whether global warming is true or not. As people who've watched repeatedly know, I'm a skeptic. Chris is not. So, but let's assume for this particular argument or debate, discussion, that global warming is an issue. Is Bill Gates correct that that government is the only solution to this problem? Chris?
I don't think there's anything outside government intervention which could remotely drive private enterprise in the direction of doing anything about climate change. The whole system is looking for short-term profits, and they are not going to look at their externalities unless they are forced to by government intervention. I actually think it needs more than just government intervention. It needs multiple government intervention, because obviously with an issue like that, what you do here is not a complete answer. You've got to have it done in a lot of places at the same time. So yes, I'm convinced government is the only way to protect the problem.
Alan?
Well, I do think government has a role to play. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think what Gates is saying is that, and Chris hinted at it, is that there at the moment there just isn't any financial incentive for the private sector to really go after renewable energy and dealing with these issues. I do agree with, I think, something you indicated, Elgin, is that the best innovation comes from the private sector, no doubt about it. So the question then for me is, how can there be a partnership between the private sector and government in order to deal with the issue of carbon emissions? And you know, I don't know what the ultimate solution is to that, and I do think also it is a global thing. You know, you can have the West cutting down their carbon emissions, but if India continues to you know, put what they're putting into the air, it's not going to help a whole lot.
Jill?
Well, I'm afraid I tend to agree with Chris. I think it's a matter of both incentive and enforcement. That either the government has, as a minimum, to set up, for instance, tax incentives so that business will start to act in the long term rather than the immediate short term, which stock market operations tends to insist on. And if business doesn't operate in that way, then enforcement, again, has to come from a regulatory system which is external to the profit motive. So I'm afraid I would tend to agree with Chris on that.
Well, it sounds like we're starting off with a broad agreement here. I would, again, given the stipulation that climate change was real, I do think some sort of external factor has to come into the marketplace, because the real issue would then be, how do you assign a cost to the CO2 being emitted, and a system of carbon tax and possibly exchanges where you could exchange carbon. If you incentivize yourself, you could sell your excess credits to somebody else. Would be a way. I also even agree that you've got to look at this as a global problem. I think one of the big issues, for example, California, put in some very stringent controls on climate and carbon there. But the real problem isn't the West, even Europe or United States. The real problem is coming out of developing countries like China and India, and potentially even out of countries that haven't developed yet. And I think that's the real challenge: is how do you do this and not devastate countries that, where you end up saying, well, to the West, well, we have ours, so tough luck to all you other guys that haven't had a chance to develop yet.
I think there's also an international issue in that if you place a lot of cost on our industry in terms of reducing carbon emissions, and someone else is not putting a lot of cost on industry, that is going to give their industry a significant advantage, which is a topic we covered, I think, last week. Something needs to be done there too, which is why I focus on it really needing to be an international effort. Not that I'm saying that the fact that it isn't a perfect international effort doesn't mean that individual governments should not act now, because I actually think the issue is urgent.
Yes, I would tend to agree with that, Chris. There's a certain amount of evidence that the Chinese government is beginning to wake up to the problems of massive pollution levels. I think the work that they had to put in for the Olympics in, was it 2008? Really was a bit of an eye-opener, and they've had some ecological catastrophes since, which has made them aware of it. But they have such an enormous amount of space that they can actually afford to have some post-industrial wastelands and not really notice it. So yeah. I think the real problem is that the developed world can very quickly appear to be imperialist, and this can then become a slogan which is brandished by the developing world as a reason why they should not do anything, because we caused an awful lot of damage to the environment 200 years ago when we started the Industrial Revolution, and they're just playing catch up.
Yeah. I do think there's an issue of not only how do you limit pollution in the West, but how do you encourage the development in third world countries that desperately need to develop without causing the ecological disaster. I mean, China, I agree, China's got a problem. And I'm saying this as a person that is skeptical of global warming, but apart from global warming, there's smog issue, and there's pollution issues beyond global warming that I would tend to agree with. And how do you assess the costs on those, and yet allow people to develop and not make developing countries prohibited, where you're basically keeping them third world?
Mm.
I've got to say that from my point of view, the best solution to this, going back to the research on these issues topic, is if we can develop sources of renewable energy which are actually cheaper than burning the fossil fuels, that could sell to the third world.
Yes.
That would sell to the first world. I mean, even business, pretty much everybody would be, if you can come up with a source of power that's cheaper, that would pretty much solve the problem. But then, that's where the real nub is, barring something like cold fusion, which
seems solar energy does seem to be a very promising direction.
Yes.
I've got two couples who are close friends who've installed solar panels very recently. Yes, you're one of them. The others live about a mile up the road from us. And they've done it not because of some airy-fairy fantasy about being kind to the environment, but because it makes sound financial sense to them. And if that works in our dank grey climate, then one can't help but feel that sub-Saharan Africa would be able to make use of it if it could be made available at an initial cost. It's not the running cost, it is the initial outlay that's the problem. And if it was made available as an affordable initial cost, I think a lot of work could be done in that direction.
I agree, and I think there are potential solutions out there, but and this is one thing I would say is that I think the ultimate solution is going to be found in the marketplace, and government can certainly help that, but at some point, if you're going to really solve this, you have to solve it in a way that improves people's lives and doesn't make them worse.
True. I think the role of government has got to be surely to, well, redistribute the massive tax subsidies that it gives to some forms of power and aim them towards other forms of power. If a fraction of the amount of tax subsidy that went into the oil industry in my country, let alone yours, were to be redirected towards renewable energy forms, I think there would be a great deal of progress made, which would make it economically a lot more viable, a much more attractive option to big business and to developing countries.
Okay, well, let's move on to the second half of Bill Gates's, which is somewhat tied to that, which he made this statement in the article that that R&D research is basically funded, something the government does. In fact, it says since World War II, U.S. government R&D has defined the state of the art in almost every area. The private sector is in general inept. And that's something I completely disagree with. But Alan, you've been pretty quiet. Why don't you start off with on this one?
Well, I do think that the R&D, I mean, I think that they have done really good research. I think that they're worth having around. I do believe that the best innovation, you can make the case that the most innovative technology has really, I agree, has come from the private sector, because the private sector has to remain competitive. If you're going to be in business, you've got to continue to innovate. So, the way I see this is, and I think maybe this relates back to the first question, is that I think we need government to kind of get the ball rolling on some of this in reference to renewable energy. But once it becomes financially a positive thing for the private sector to get involved, that's where you will see the kinds of innovation in renewable energy. So I do think the R&D has done good work, but I think, yeah, I would say Gates' word inept is a little strong. I wouldn't go there and agree with him on that.
Okay, Chris?
Yes, you're right that an awful lot of research comes out of the private sector in the States. Particularly on the basis that the states subcontract a huge amount of R&D work for military purposes, and an immense amount of developments come out of the military focus in the States. But the area that I see as having fueled masses of developments on your side of the Atlantic is the space program, which was a government program.
Mm-hmm.
And there are huge numbers of innovations which have been forced by the need to produce something for that, which would not have happened without government. Yeah, large government labs are not necessarily the most efficient way to do research. But what we're talking about there is organisation, not whether government should pay for it. I don't think there's any doubt that for an awful lot of basic research, it is not going to get done unless government pays for it. Over here, frankly, if government doesn't fund research in universities, most of that doesn't get done either, and certainly blue sky research doesn't. There's no way you're going to get a set of shareholders to support somebody researching something because it's interesting and you never know, but something might come of it in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years. The only way you get that kind of research is government funding. It might well best be done in universities which are potentially private. They're not terribly private here, but in the States it's somewhat different, I know.
Yes, as you know, Chris, my husband worked in a research institute owned by a very large multinational corporation during the 80s, and finally left them because they were undergoing one of the recessions, the results of the 1991 recession. And in essence, they reduced their research and development spend so that 2/3 of their researchers and the projects they were involved in were cut within a 12-month period. That's going to happen as long as the primary allegiance is to the shareholders and to the stock market.
Yes.
And I think one has to look also at the impact of government contracts. You look at the aerospace industry, for instance. There is no major aircraft manufacturer in the Western world, and therefore really in any part of the world, that has not depended very heavily indeed on government contracts as the focus of developing the technology, which has then been applied to the commercial world of aircraft as well. I mean, the very concept of jet aircraft was developed for the military in this country and passed over to our allies and then developed as part of the government contracts for Lockheed and Boeing in particular. And that you cannot say, therefore, that they are efficient private sector doing the good research and overlook the fact that they could not have done that research were it not for the government contracts which they were they gained very massively from in the 50s and 60s.
Yeah, I think we have, in my view, we have somewhat of a chicken and egg. I tend to agree that much of the research is obviously funded by government. But to me, it's a chicken and egg issue in terms of you had lots of companies doing lots of research before, and then government comes in and offers to start handing out money if you do research along the path that they determine. And so, yeah, they pick up those contracts and they begin to focus all their research in that area because government is funding it. So to me, it's somewhat of a chicken and egg problem. I just honestly don't know how much of that research would continue if it wasn't. I know there are companies out there that prize research. 3M, for example, I believe, has a program where everybody in the company, at least all the engineers, are expected to work on a private project of their own creation at least a couple of hours a week. And out of that, sometimes they get some fairly good ideas, like sticky notes, where one guy invented a glue that didn't actually work out very well and didn't know what to do with it, and suddenly, next thing you know, they had the sticky notes issue. So there is some of that going on. You have a lot of the pharmaceutical companies doing a lot of the work in terms of research there that doesn't get funded by the government, and some of it is. I mean, the major ones set aside money to do research into rare diseases they know they're not going to make a profit out of, but they just set aside money to do that because that's just what they do. So I think there is some research, clearly research that would go on if government wasn't funding it. The other aspect of it that gives me a little bit of concern is the funneling of the orientation of research into particular areas where the government is basically saying we're going to pick this or we're going to pick that, and that's where we're going to put our money. And that that at times gets to be more politically driven than science driven. So that's an aspect that concerns me as well. But in general, I do think the government has a role to play in this, and so we're sort of going off 2-2. I disagree with Gates that they define it, but I think there's a lot of good research that goes on outside of government, but government does play a major role. So,
and I think in many ways...
Go ahead. No, go ahead and finish up.
I think in many ways the example of the pharmaceutical industry you gave, in a way, was a bit of an own goal, because when the Ebola crisis exploded in West Africa, the pharmaceutical industry had no resources, because Ebola was not something that had come across their radar. It was not something that seemed to be profitable, and so it took massive government intervention in a number of countries to push through research to get something out that was a vaccine and was in some way going to be able to help to cure the Ebola problem. Whereas the profitable areas, and I mean, I have a friend in New York who works in pharmaceutical advertising, and it's very obvious that a huge amount of money goes into the profitable areas, and particularly the producing of very slightly different medications which can be patented and sold for a lot more. And the extreme cost of pharmaceuticals in an entirely free market is something that's quite horrific, actually. So I'm not entirely convinced by that argument. I think even there, pharmaceutical research in this country does take place in the private sector as well as in the universities, but they have to focus on a very specific market which is very, very cost conscious, and is much more about outcome rather than creating new needs. And again, I think it is that melding of the government and the private sector that is producing much more effective work. After the first ever in vitro fertilization, for instance, was very much government funded, and then moving on to have some private input as well.
Okay. Yeah, I don't remember. I know there was a Ebola vaccine that was in process and hadn't quite reached it. I honestly don't remember the funding, whether that was a private company that had developed that, or whether it was developed in line with government. But there are definitely a lot of topics there to discuss, and we don't have time for it today. So, but okay, let's move on to another topic, which is one that Jill wanted to talk about, which was in South Carolina. We had an incident with a police officer in a classroom, and I think it's a little bit of a tough situation in the sense that I think it's pretty clearly that the student was out of control, but I think it's also pretty clearly that the police officer got out of control. And Jill, since you raised the issue, why don't you give us your thoughts on that?
Right, I should come clean and say that I spent 34 years as a teacher of English and drama, both in the state system and in private schools. So I've got a fair amount of experience of out-of-control teenagers, and having watched the video of the incident, I cannot see that that girl was out of control. I think she had pushed herself, from what I've read about the situation, to a point where she was unable to climb down, and you get this problem with the teenage psychology that once they have painted themselves into a corner, they do need a knowledgeable person who can offer them a way to come out of that corner with some shreds of their dignity intact. And that is the function of the teacher and of the school principal. Calling for the heavy mob does not strike me as a particularly helpful activity. The girl was not, as far as anything I've read about it, was not violent, was not offering violence, was not in fact doing anything more than sitting in her seat. If had I been a teacher in that situation, I would have instructed the class to turn their chairs 90 degrees and taught from a different angle so that she was effectively excluded. I see absolutely no reason to call for a security officer. I'm not entirely clear whether he was a policeman or not. I know he was called.
He was a police officer.
Yes, because the concept of a police officer in a school is something that chills me to the very marrow, I have to admit, in anything other than an educational context. But it does worry me. How do we pull a society back from a position in which that is seen as reasonable behaviour within a classroom? I mean, I'd be very interested to hear your opinions on this.
Please define reasonable. Are you talking about reasonable behavior by the student or reasonable behavior by the police officer?
Reasonable behavior. I don't think the student was behaving reasonably. 16-year-old girls behave irrationally. This is part of what being a 16-year-old girl is about. I'm thinking mainly of
or just being a 16-year-old.
We've all been there. Well, Chris and I have certainly seen our own 16-year-olds go through some interesting occasions. But the conduct of the teacher and of the principal, I'm including, as well as the violence of the police officer. How have we reached a point where anybody thought that the escalation of that situation was the rational way to behave in a classroom setup?
Yeah. Chris, you want to jump in, or Alan?
I was just appalled to find police officers being used to keep order in a classroom, and he shouldn't have been there in the first place. He shouldn't have behaved the way he did, and the thought that anyone could consider that was in any way an acceptable situation just horrifies me. It certainly wouldn't be one I'd consider acceptable in this country, and it wouldn't happen, frankly.
Well, I think it would lead to prosecution, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Alan?
Yeah, I don't know why the police were called in the first place. That's what continues to baffle me. I served as a police chaplain for 2 years, and my experience in the schools was that the only time the police would have been called was if there had been some kind of a violent situation, or for educational purposes or public relations purposes. You go there to build relationships with students.
Absolutely.
And law enforcement. And I agree. The escalation of it was just very unfortunate, and I think the task is to diffuse. I don't think you excuse the behavior, but I sure don't think that the answer is to take the student down along with her desk. And you know, you could always, I guess, do an in-school suspension for a week and you know, let her learn the consequences and enjoy the week of that good old activity called boredom. You know, there were ways to deal with this, and what happened is just not the way to deal with it.
Yeah, I don't know the background of the school. In terms of police officers, unfortunately, in some school districts, assault by students is a significant problem. And I don't know the background of the school district to know whether that was an issue, whether you know, the teacher feared for her safety or not because of past experience. But unfortunately, in America, that we've oftentimes removed a lot of the controls that teachers used to apply to control classrooms, and to the point that there's not much a teacher can do any longer. And unfortunately, if you remove a lot of those controls, police officers become the only response, and then yeah, to me it's I think the police officer is clearly at fault. I think I'm a little concerned with this whole idea of a police officer makes a mistake, their career is over. There should be some discipline area, but Barry, that's kind of a different discussion. I think it's pretty clear that the police officer was at fault here in terms of going. Ultimately he was the one that was lost control, and he's the one that shouldn't have.
Mm. I mean, I speak here as the daughter of a fairly senior police officer. I mean, my father's dead now, sadly, but he rose to a very high rank indeed in the police service. And I think he would have been horrified by that action. And I'm also fairly confident that he would have expected that officer to have been prosecuted for assault, and would have expected, I mean, Chris knows more about the nitty-gritty than I, but I would have expected some sort of custodial sentence to follow from behaviour like that. So I don't know, what would be the case, Chris?
First offence, maybe not a custodial sentence. Suspended sentence would be quite possible. But I would also expect, as a police disciplinary matter, that he would be sacked for an attack of that ferocity that was unmerited. Mm.
But then I would expect similar discipline to be taken had he done that to, I don't know, a shoplifter trying to escape a shop. Similar, that level of ferocity in flooring a shoplifter who was offering that degree of resistance, i.e. very little, would also be a disciplinary matter.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're at the bottom of the hour, and this is a chance where we get to introduce ourselves before we go into the second half. And again, my name's Elgin Hushbeck, and I'm a publisher. I've had 4 books published. You can find them at my website or Googling my name, and my website is hushbeck.com. Chris.
My name's Chris Ann. I'm one of Energian's editors. I blog at airlines, E-Y-R-E, lines.energian.net, and I've got a book under construction but not published.
Alan.
I am Revere. I also am an Energian author and editor. I blog at alanrevere.com. That's Alan with 2 A's and 2 L's. And I am the pastor of the First United Methodist Church of Akron, Ohio, and I'm a professional fellow in theology at Ashland Theological Seminary.
And Jill.
I'm Jill Othen. I live in the English Midlands, not far from Stratford-on-Avon, where I've recently embarked on my second master's degree, this time entirely focused on Shakespeare. Previously, I did a master's degree at Warwick University, which is a very different institution. I was an English teacher for 34 years. I've done quite a bit of writing. I've had 1 or 2 things published, mostly either theoretical critical analysis or fiction. I'm currently working on a young adult's fiction at the moment.
Good. Well, that actually ties us into our next topic quite well. This came from a video done at Prager University. And basically, the issue that it was raising was essentially what's going on with liberal arts, and what sparked the video was a recent, or not recent, but just came to light that you can now get a degree in English at UCLA and not study a single word of Shakespeare, and you actually begin to look at the curriculum, and the curriculum actually has very little to do with what we would traditionally call English or English literature. This is not a new problem. I know my mother-in-law, when she was working on her degree back in the 80s, had an English professor that she took, and the class actually didn't really deal much with English. The first day she walked into class, and they had a map of Central America put up, and they basically spent the entire course talking about America's policy in Central America, with the Nicaraguans and the Contras and El Salvador and all of that. So the issues with the curriculum, I know Victor David Hansen, who's a classical scholar, has written a book, Who Killed Homer, and his basic thesis is that classical studies, i.e. Greek studies, has basically abandoned Greek literature and has basically delved off into other issues. When they deal with Greek literature, they're writing articles such as feminism in Homer and things like that. So there seems to be an issue at the university, and so I think we'll go first to Jill, since she's currently involved. What's your reaction to being able to get an English degree at a prestigious university and not actually study an English literature degree and not actually study any Shakespeare?
That does horrify me, because when I was applying to university, and rather a long time ago, one of my first criteria for selection of courses was that I must be able to do Shakespeare in each of the years of my studies. And that was how I ended up at Durham University in the end, because they offered that option. And in fact, in my teaching career, at one point we had inflicted on us a head of department who had come from a university where Shakespeare was entirely optional. I'm assuming that UCLA does offer courses on Shakespeare, but simply that its requirements don't include a compulsory Shakespeare option. Is that true, as far as you know?
I don't know for sure. I would suspect that they do, although their focus on Shakespeare, you could probably find a traditional course in Shakespeare. You might have to look hard to find it.
And I think there are some very interesting modern approaches. I mean, if we concentrate on Shakespeare for the moment, a few weeks ago I spent a fascinating 2-hour seminar on The Taming of the Shrew. I don't know if you know this, but it's a play in which a man openly avows that he has come to find himself a wealthy wife, persuades the father of Catherine that she is willing to marry him, and then after the marriage takes her off to his home, where a sequential mistreatment leads to her accepting that her only mode of survival is to accept everything he tells her to do. And that is a very, very difficult play for a modern woman to engage with. It's much more in line, obviously, with early modern theories about how women behave and think and how they should be encouraged to conform. And in fact, they invited an actor, a male actor, who performed in a theatre group called Propeller a couple of years ago, and he had taken the role of Kate in an all-male production of The Taming of the Shrew, and had come through the rehearsal process totally convinced that the only valid way of performing this role was that she would be a completely beaten woman, that she was in every way, her identity, she had been removed from her, she was an abused woman. And his performance of the final speech, in which she publicly submits to her husband, was of one who the filth and the bruises were very clear, and the broken voice showed that she was submitting as the only option within this abusive marriage. Now, as a way of looking at the play, that certainly would not have been recognised by any of Shakespeare's contemporaries. But we aren't Shakespeare's contemporaries, and if Shakespeare is going to continue to be taught, then I think we have to find ways of understanding his plays, not in terms of an up-to-date allegory, but as something that still has a relevance, still has a validity. At Warwick, I was taught by a tutor who'd recently completed his doctorate, and was himself, in fact, from California. And his way of seeing Shakespeare was entirely through philosophy and politics, a theory called presentist Shakespeare's, so that in fact our lectures on Hamlet were entirely through Marx or Freud. I expressed an interest in A Midsummer Night's Dream and was told I needed to read Hegel, so I'm afraid I bottled out and did The Tempest instead. All I had to do for The Tempest was Montaigne. So it's true that these different lenses are being used within the university system, but they are, I would say, all being used as a number of different means of forcing students to think for themselves. At university level, certainly beyond American sophomore level, the main purpose of a tutor is surely to stimulate students to react, to argue back, to find alternative theories, to synthesize their own understanding and their own ideas.
Okay, let's get Chris in here. Chris, you have some reaction as a fellow Englishman, or Shakespeare not being required?
I was interested in the clip from Prager University that you directed us to, which was not only saying that there was no requirement to study Shakespeare, but that there was a requirement to study one of gender, race, ethnicity, or disability, a requirement to study one of imperial, transnational, or post-colonial studies, and a requirement to study critical theory. And basically, the approach of Prager was very much, there are all these great people in the past who we should be studying, and we should not be looking at all these newfangled things, particularly, I suspect, the undertone was nothing to do with gender, race, ethnicity, or disability. I have to make some allowances for Prager, which I generally consider is so incredibly right-wing as to be unbelievable by somebody this side of the Atlantic. But I can see a point if you are forced to study all of these things, but you are not forced to study the greatest writer in the English language ever during a course. A part of the balance has gone wrong. I mean, I have my own issues about critical theory, which involves huge amounts of extremely heavyweight philosophy, and I think inflicting that on undergraduate literature students is cruel and unusual punishment. But I can see some of their point, though it is extremely slanted.
Yeah. I would argue or point out that he's not saying, or she is actually was from the Brookings Institute, he's at Prager University, but wasn't actually Prager himself.
Yeah.
He's not so much saying you shouldn't study these others, but to study them at the exclusion of Shakespeare, or there was the other person pointed out was Mozart. To have it was one female student wondered why Mozart was inflicted upon her as a college student. I thought was a little extreme, but Alan, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'd say to that college student, Mozart was inflicted upon her because it was an attempt to help her to believe that there is a God, because once you listen to Mozart, you cannot be an atheist. So that would be one thing. Yeah, look, we live in a global village. Voices are diverse, contexts are diverse. There are different ways now of looking at things in this small world, and so people want to be able to tell those narratives, because this really is about telling narratives and reading history and reading the way things are in literature. So I understand that debate and discussion, and I think we need to be open to all of those voices and be part of that discussion. I would say what concerns me is when we decide that there is certain literature that we must now reject or out of bounds because it doesn't reflect our values, our 21st century Western values. So take The Taming of the Shrew, for example, as was raised earlier. Sure, that's a tough thing to get through if you're a 21st century woman. And by the way, if you're a 21st century Western man, it ought to also be a little disturbing. But why would we reject that? Why do not we understand that in its context, see the value that it has for us? Elgin, you may remember that a few years ago there was a row at one of our universities where some students were up in arms because they were reading Mark Twain, and of course you have some racial slur language in there, some racist language from the 19th century, so the students were up in arms, and you had the university basically saying, this is one book that we're not going to read, basically caving into these young students who don't understand. I go back to the 16-year-old who wouldn't stop talking on her cell phone. They're still 16 years old, 17, 18 years old. Instead of seeing that literature in its context and how it reflects something of a time that we need to know about and remember and have discussion about. So if we're going to have good academic discussion in our universities, in our educational system over any subject, we have to be willing to put some of our sensibilities to the side so that we can have the good, rigorous, enlightening discussion that helps make things better for all of us.
And Alan, I'd like to interject, because I actually used that example as a teaching point, that it was in fact a high school in Oakland in California.
Thank you. Yes.
So, and
actually, several schools had that issue, but yeah, continue.
Yeah, the school board wanted to take it off the reading list. And in fact, for some years, I did it with my year 8, who would be 7th graders, I think, in American money. And as part of spending a term looking at Huckleberry Finn, which meant reading some sections, watching a film version, but also using it as a platform for developing other skills. I actually gave them a number of documents about Huckleberry Finn, both from the 1880s, when there was a very strong move to have it banned in Connecticut and Massachusetts because of its use of appalling low-life language, and the fact that Huck, the speaker, the narrator of the story, was using such atrocious language that no genteel family should be asked to allow into their household, going through to the totally different language issues that were being raised in Oakland. And in fact, I got my 12 and 13-year-olds to produce some excellent argument and debate. We used it for debating skills and analytical writing skills, about the extent to which you should engage with a book which contains offensive elements. And I think that that's why Huckleberry Finn should definitely be on every curriculum as an option available for the teachers, providing it's taught with sensitivity to current norms. Sorry, I shouldn't have interrupted you.
I would argue, I mean, what strikes me most about Huckleberry Finn is that when you look at Mark Twain, what Mark Twain is trying to say about the races there, he's actually much more of a 21st century person. Absolutely. And he's using the period and the time. The other aspect is that the words used there are not, they're extremely offensive today, but they weren't offensive at the time. And for example, I recently went through the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and not being prepared for and never heard them before, I was surprised to hear Lincoln using the infamous N-word.
Yes.
But, clearly he was not arguing for, a traditional view of slavery there. I mean, he's not quite into the 21st century what we would have today, but he was ahead of his time per se in terms of moving people forward. I think that's one of the things we oftentimes miss is we look back and we judge ancient writers by our modern view and our modern standards rather than looking at, well, where was society at the time and were they ahead or behind of their society? Were they pulling people forward or were they pushing society backwards? One other thing, I wanted to take a slightly different direction here, and one of the phenomenons that is occurring in modern universities, I mean, if all this was being done for more open debate and more critical thinking, I would be much more amenable to it, but it seems like it's having the opposite effect. It seems like it's closing off debate, and two of the things that are going around now, we have the concept of microaggressions, but we also have this thing called trigger warnings. So, for example, if you were to teach Huckleberry Finn or Tom Sawyer today in a university with adults, you would be required in many universities to issue trigger warnings to the class to prepare them for what's about to happen in the book so that they don't get shocked by it. And they actually had an institute at a university where they had a debate on a particular woman's issue, and they had a pro and a con. And since they had a con point of view, they actually set up a safe room on campus where women could go with teddy bears and blankets and be comforted because they were allowing this speaker who disagreed with some women issue onto the campus to state her position. And that's kind of typical that I see. We just this week had another speaker rejected, an invitation to a conservative speaker rejected because some of the liberal students objected. And when they do go on, quite frankly, oftentimes they literally have to take bodyguards so they don't get assaulted when they speak. So this is what's happening on American campuses. Is there anything like that happening in England?
There's a very recent incident, in fact, where a fairly notorious feminist speaker was invited to speak at Cardiff University, and there was considerable opposition to that invitation because she is transphobic and in fact had a lengthy interview on a late evening news program in which